Hello and welcome to today's Industry Experts panel, DevOps, a magical unicorn that is transforming service delivery. Who made up that title? I think it's me. DevOps has been getting a lot of buzz lately, especially in cloud and hybrid operations, but enterprise generally isn't quick to adopt it for a variety of reasons, and that's what today's discussion is about. We've brought together a panel to introduce the advantages of adopting DevOps approach, discuss the best practices for DevOps success in enterprises, and also to learn tips and tricks that will help get management on board in the first place. With us today are Matt Ray. He's the Director of Partner Integration from Chef. And of course, you guys know Chef is a platform that turns infrastructure into a really programmable resource instead of just doing lots and lots of automation that you're usually used to doing by hand. Next to him is Michael Cote, goes by Cote and has probably one of the coolest Twitter handles of the bunch. He is the Director of Technical Product Marketing for Pivotal Software. And Pivotal, of course, focuses on big cloud and big data platforms. But more than that, Pivotal Labs really does help existing teams come up to speed with a lot of the cutting edge technology and tool that's available, rather than just dumping more tech on them and expecting you to instantly adapt. Next, we have Caroline McCrory. She's the VP of Business Development for CloudSoft, and that's the company behind Apache Brooklyn. That provides multi-cloud application management, and again, an enormous advocate for open source. You're going to see that as we talk about this across this panel. These are all big open source and cloud advocates. And of course, Dave McCrory, I think a lot of you know, he's the Chief Technology at Basho. The Basho Data Platform, which is kind of interesting. It provides not only big data, but also it's focused on IoT and huge scale distributed applications. And again, all based on open source. We're really excited and fortunate to have this team with us. It's a lot of expertise for open source, cloud, and DevOps. Lots and lots of horsepower all on this panel at once. Thank you guys so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So do you ever feel sometimes like you guys are just at Connie and Dave's house party talking about this again?
It's definitely a recurring conversation.
Yeah.
But over the years, it's slowly changed. You know, I guess people used to argue about what is DevOps, what is the definition of it, and now people are like, well, you know, when you see it, and kind of moving the conversation along to, well, let's not argue about the semantics. Let's talk about doing it.
Okay, so who wants to take that as the first question? For an enterprise audience, what is DevOps?
Well, the way I often think about it is it's the thing about the history of DevOps and how it came about, which is to say there was a bunch of people running in the consumer space. I like the notion of big cloud, but like web scale, high scale applications and things like that, and they were having trouble keeping it up and delivering the software they were writing into production as quickly as they wanted. Let's say weekly. We'll let all the crazy people who want to do daily feel special. And it just takes a different way of developing your software, QAing your software, and also operating your software if you were working under those kind of conditions. And so really, for the enterprise sense, and this also gets to what Matt Ray was saying, is that DevOps has been around for depending on what phrase you use, 5 or 6 years. And it does require drinking a lot of coffee to still be able to talk about it without falling asleep after this long. But it is interesting because different audiences come along and they have different needs, right? So all the webscale.com folks, it's been a long time since they've been doing it and using it. Whereas with enterprise people, it's like you get to rediscover a whole new reason to do all these practices and things. And they have a lot different motivations and constraints and types of things like that. So you get to take this hammer and figure out how to pound in a different type of nail.
Right, and that's one of the points here is that you look at Amazon, for example. They figured out SDN, at least as they do it, a very, very long time ago. And see, now there's open standards that are being developed, and now products that are actually not specific to one platform or another, but can actually be used by enterprise and are beginning to appear. So you mentioned QA as one of those aspects. Is that one of the biggest things that differentiates how it's used by very large operators versus enterprise, and that enterprise doesn't typically tend to think of QA, or how that sort of extends to departments outside of core IT?
I still think it's it's the approach that QA has taken in different types of organizations. And at least in my view, part of it wraps around the continuous integration, continuous delivery and deployment, those mentalities. If you're doing QA classically in an enterprise, you have one person or a small group of people, and they're going through and looking at the app and seeing if it looks like it meets the requirements that they had written and that it functions properly, if you're lucky. Right. Then there's kind of we're going to do QA for shipping software or something like that, and that might be a bit more rigorous. And then there's kind of the new generation of QA, and that's where you not only get into automated QA and making sure that good tests are written and making sure that there's actually a different level of user interaction or a view on QA, but then there's A/B testing, where with software that's following more modern approaches, you'll have two different ways that you believe where you could have something done. There's A and B, and you might deploy both of them and see which one people are more attracted to, A or B, and whichever one is providing the greater value or the greater response or whatever it is that you're looking for, you might end up choosing that way, as an example. So it's becoming more sophisticated, but to become more sophisticated, you have to become more automated. And at least in my mind, that's one of the ways that all of this is evolving, is to become more sophisticated, you end up needing more complexity, and that's driving more automation.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, I think what kind of differentiates QA from like the early big IT or big web, those sorts of companies versus traditional enterprise, is a lot of the early big web companies didn't have QA. I mean, when people start talking about the origin of DevOps, they talk about breaking down the walls between developers and operators, and then in the enterprise, there's another set of walls in there, and it's like developers, QA, and operators. And back in my enterprise days, we used to throw things over the wall to QA. And it was QA's problem, they'd throw it back, but there was the disconnect there. And then when you get to the web, a lot of those shops, they just don't have QA. And it's, you see something, you fix it, it goes right back to IT or right back to dev, and they push it out the next day or a few hours later.
I would agree with that, although I mean, I think the mindset was different as well, at least at that time. In the enterprise, it was QA is the enemy of the developer because they keep finding more work for us to go and have to do before we can ship this software. And at the more early web scale days, it was we need to do QA, but it's part of our job as an engineering group to do some QA and to catch these things. So instead of it being the enemy, it's more of it's the friend, or it's just part of what we do. And I think that's a fundamental difference.
I think that highlights another folksy way to look at what DevOps is like what if developers felt responsible for their code in production? And that sounds really simple, but that would kind of require a lot of developers to change their pants in panic. So it gets to your QA point of if you don't have QA as a formal role, it means everyone's responsible for QA. And so you start to develop your code differently and test it differently. And similarly, people in operations who want to make sure that they don't get woken up early in the morning, they want to make sure that they have the right tools and the code that they're responsible for has been properly QA'd. So, there is a tremendous amount of QA that gets involved in things, but it's not like a formal staged process. The sort of enemy of of the developers, if you will.
And when you put developers and operators on the same team, operators can say, when it blows stack over here, could you make this a little nicer so when I turn around and hand it right back to you, you could tell me what broke here, and it's about making things work in operation.
I think one of the best practices that I have come across from my analyst time, and Cote will probably relate to this as well, was getting to actually meet Sam Guggenheimer. And so Sam is a big proponent of the early DevOps. He's been talking about it for years and years and years at other conferences like OSCON and stuff like that. And the Visual Studio Online team, as an example, they have a 3-week sprint worldwide. So it doesn't matter where the holidays are and things like that. But the team is a worldwide team. It's completely distributed. They follow 3-week sprints regardless of who's out sick or anything else. But what's really neat is those engineers also have specific clients that they actually do, conversations with. So they will have once a month conversations with their customers and actually understand how the use cases are doing. So they built QA into the whole thing that the engineers developed for, and they know how the stuff is actually being used. So they see, I have a cool idea, I actually want to put this feature in because I have a customer that's asking for it. These are the problems that they're seeing. Who else has accounts that are seeing the same thing? And so there's this continuous process of client improvement and customer satisfaction as well, which I think has always been missing in the past when all of us would just develop the stuff ourselves and then we would never talk to anybody else because it was, my code's better than your code.
Pass bench test, it's good.
Well, it's interesting as well in that we're trying to move to the shorter cycle, and anyone that's dealt with a big project in the enterprise has found if the release train is 6 months or a year or greater, as it gets closer to leaving the station, everyone's trying to stuff as much stuff as they can in because they know the next cycle is 6 months or a year away and they don't want to wait. Right. And if it's only cut in that way, you end up with a lot of poor quality code that gets jammed in there at the last minute, and then lots of bugs, lots of problems and other issues, which leads to people getting woken up at night.
Yeah, and that's like one of the fun tricks that started back in the 2000s with agile software development is as Dave is saying, a lot of what the consequence of what we're talking about is doing less in the same period of time, and not in the same period of time, but in smaller batches, if you will. So when you hear a lot of this discussion that we're having, you're like, well, how do I implement my 200-page MRD in a 1-week window? That's crazy, right? And the answer is like, well, you implement 5 pages of it, like in a week-long period. And instead of working on a 6 or 12-month cycle where you've got, as Dave was saying, this huge batch of things, right, that ends up like that highway out of Atlanta in The Walking Dead, just overstuffed cars and people eating each other.
Right.
Like, instead, you break things into smaller batches. And if you think about, there's a lot of like mumbo jumbo and lean manufacturing stuff and culture and religion around this, but a lot of it amounts to, so if you do less stuff more often, your life is gonna be happier, right? Like, and again, I think it's interesting if you're approaching DevOps to think about what are the structural constraints this process is giving you that change the way everything operates. And that's another one is, what if you only put out 1 patch a week, right? Or instead of putting out a gigantic release after 6 months, you put out these tiny things every week. And how would that change the way you would have to do your operations and development in QA?
Well, and back when we were doing Agile, it was, the business owners would have the fast feedback for the developers, and the developers would turn things around every 2 weeks. And we still weren't talking about QA and operations. And so DevOps is almost like, well, it's just Agile for the rest of the people involved.
Right. And I remember actually seeing this at a customer where there was a field engineering team that was based, this was a bank that was based at the bank. So they would be getting a lot of the features that were coming in. They would be then making the fixes. And you would hope on the back end that these features were then being rolled into the next major release. Yeah. At one point, the upgrade for the next major release had 65 different Jira tickets that had to go into it. But they didn't realize that for them to actually do that upgrade was going to be more than the bank's 8-hour window. So it had to do a rollback, because when they were getting close to the 7-hour mark, they were not even halfway done. So that QA part was missing because, well, yeah, these features have been in production at the bank, there'll be no problem. But when you start to roll so many of them into a major release, it takes a long time, and no one figured out that it would.
Well, and that kind of unlocked, one of the tenets one of the possible tenets of DevOps, depending on how you define it, of automation and continuous integration and continuous delivery is like, yes, the bank may have an 8-hour window every 2 months to do an upgrade, but you could actually be testing those upgrades daily or faster.
Well, something we've kind of, I guess, assumed that I don't think's really been mentioned directly is by doing these small incremental changes, when something breaks, you likely know why it broke. Yeah. You're not, well, where in those 65 things did it go wrong?
Right. Yeah, we've got 65 Jira tickets.
That's right. Oh. Somewhere in there, something's gone wrong. Now, how do we figure that out?
Right.
Yeah.
Coffee.
Or especially for enterprise where you're rolling back help desk tickets, right? Because then it's a storm of tickets. They've been passed back and forth, usually team to team, and then actually trying to figure out to roll those changes back gets to be really tricky. Sort of the firewall upgrade that goes horribly wrong, and there's nothing else to do except send that email out. One thing that I hear you talking about, especially when you're talking about sprints, is scheduling and sort of a regular cadence for operational change. I had a customer make what I thought was a great joke, but then I realized there was tremendous wisdom in it. He said that he never had any accidents when he made changes in production, because he wanted to protect his right to make his changes actually during the work week and not have to do anything at night. And I think in IT, especially in the enterprise side of the house, is that we have this bad habit of sort of scheduling around acquisition and deployment. So it's like, we're going to buy this new SAN, and then we're going to do a swag on how much time it's going to take. And then we'll just say, we're going to deploy on this date. Then if you're lucky or unlucky, depending on how you look at it, it's going to be a piece of cake. You've scottied it way long, but then everyone jumps in with other things that they can do because they're going to have a maintenance window. Or more likely, you haven't included enough of an estimate for time, and so then you start adding, you're crammed for time, and you don't have time to test anything. You also didn't allow budget to actually have a dev environment that you could actually test in to do things like, actual capacity planning and load testing. Yeah. And so then they sort of run into it, and they also then have all of these overlapping dates of execution of changes to operations, instead of just having a regular cadence where you say, this is our date, or every 3 weeks we have a window where we make changes, and then being smart about sizing what's going to be included in that change.
Right, yeah. I mean, this like kind of points to the sardonic kind of dark side of the DevOps world, right? Which kind of continues part of, one of the things in Agile development that was nice was this idea of, we should talk to each other and expose information. And so that we know what's going on, right? But
not the ops guys.
Right, exactly. and as Matt pointed out, like one way of looking at a lot of DevOps is like, now the ops people can come to the Agile party, and that changes a lot of things around. But to your point, right? Like the sardonic side of DevOps would be like, well, don't do dumb stuff, right? Like if you're upgrading your storage array, that doesn't mean you should also upgrade your CRM system at the same time, and then also install this weird patch and do that. And like, have you tested any of that? And it's like, so that's going to fail,
well,
right?
Or smaller, better changes,
right? And it's easy to kind of be flippant about like, oh, don't do dumb stuff, like to make fun of myself a few minutes ago. But part of how something like DevOps tries to enforce that, if you will, is again an openness of information and being very open about everything and making sure that things are documented to a certain extent, to like shame people who suggest doing dumb things and then do them, but hopefully more importantly to prevent dumb things from happening and then educate the people so that they become smarter. So hopefully they were ignorant and they just needed some learning.
Well, I will say I was involved a few years ago in a project, and I was very shortly involved in upgrading an SAP system. And the plan was laid out before any work began, and it had time windows that were, okay, we're going to have 2 weeks to start doing this, and then at the completion of that, we'll have 3 days to get this blueprinting done right. And then after those 3 days, there were a chain of timing that were impossible. And I said in the meeting, this will fail. Yeah. This is impossible. You have too many tight windows and you haven't done any investigation into this work. You will not succeed. And that was the end of my involvement in that project. But it turned out that they failed miserably and the date ended up slipping, I think, over 9 months. And it was so obvious, but people still will end up in this idea that they can just guesstimate every single thing all the way down for something that's going to be 9 months out. And nobody can do that.
And I think one of the advantages a lot of the early DevOps practitioners, like the big web folks, they had was their infrastructure was possibly someone else's infrastructure. So they could do test scenarios like, well, what would happen if we ran this upgrade? Well, we're not invested in our own data center. Let's just spin up 100 new instances on EC2 and see what happens. And oh, look, it falls over. And turns out we can upgrade SAP in 4 hours or something optimistic like that. And a lot of the traditional enterprises, they're saddled with, we've got a data center and we're at 85% capacity. Mm-hmm. There's no place to run a QA.
Right. And that gets really important, especially like with desktop virtualization. There were a whole lot of admins that got burned who had great success virtualizing servers and said, okay, for storage and IOP performance and everything else per system, I have these great spreadsheets that say what I'm going to need in terms of resources. And then all of a sudden, instead of turning up 10 or 20 or maybe 100 desktops. So like, hey, we're going to go live with 1,000 all at once. And then you discover that no, the model to support virtual desktops is a lot different than it is for servers, which know how to sit on a SAN. And
How about the 8 a.m. login problem?
oh yeah.
Yeah.
Wait, you mean everyone might try to log in the same 30-minute window of time?
Everyone's going to synchronize their email all in one. So I'm going to instead have enough capacity to support that all week, and it's going to sit idle the rest of the time.
And to use that as an example, I mean, I think anyone who got hired to do a DevOps role, if you made them do virtual desktop admin, would probably quit and go do something else. But like, let's say that was an example that they would do, like combining together a lot of what we were saying, and Matt Ray was making an excellent point about there are actually technology improvements that we could just lump under cloud that remove a lot of the constraints of bringing up simulations and prototypes. You can move things faster. We could probably get into all sorts of vendor sports there. But with the virtual desktop thing, as Dave was alluding to, right? Like what you would do in a DevOps culture is say, you would try to be as smart as possible ahead of time. But you would also say like, well, let's see what happened day one and analyze that. And let's not fire the person who screwed up with the document.
Yeah.
Like, let's say like, well, that didn't work out. So day two, let's tune this and see how that works. I mean, I could probably be more in the term of a couple of days, but over periods of time, let's study what's happening and let's all be friendly with each other and not kill each other.
Well, let's have a humane postmortem.
That's right. Like you'll hear the phrase blameless postmortem. So a lot of DevOps talk is about you should not yell at people. You should discover the right way to do things.
It's evidence-backed.
Exactly. That's collecting the data and doing things, and you'd be like, well, let's try to use another funny phrase in the DevOps world. Let's make new mistakes tomorrow, right? And let's
not
figure
the
out,
same ones.
Exactly.
Well, and I think to your point about Agile for the rest of us, right? I think one of the things that you can do is you tie the first things you can do is really tie your developers almost to ops if you don't have formal DevOps, at least as the second escalate point for tickets, right? So you let them know, hey, by the way, if we go down at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday, you may be getting a phone call. Yeah. So all of a sudden, code gets to be a lot better.
Oh yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
I mean, we run a fairly large SaaS, and our developers are on PagerDuty. They have windows when they're on call, and things get escalated to them on the weekend if that's when an issue happens.
They call it Hammurabi Ops.
CenturyLink does the same
thing.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah.
CenturyLink
That's part of the. In fact, some companies that's part of the onboarding process for engineers is your first day. It's like, okay, you have your logins and credentials. Yeah. All right, you're now going to work the help desk for the next 2 weeks, so you can get ramped up on what our users and people inside are having to deal with.
And that's like one of the first cultural things you have to do is like ops and dev. They need to be on the same page. Make dev feel the pain, so ops can.
Yeah, and CenturyLink Cloud's onboarding for a newcomer to their team, 3 weeks. You're on call like everyone else. They call it the Batman team, because then you have a bat phone, you have to call, and you can actually fix like what they offer all the way from the Cloud Foundry pieces through to whatever the app is that a customer is running. It's really cool.
Okay, so here's a question for you. The old expression, don't automate what you don't understand. I mean, key to automation, maybe just surviving and actually having a career that lasts more than a couple of months in IT. One of the big challenges, of course, is getting visibility into all of the different systems that you may be required that are part of a deployment process, or maybe even sort of all of the elements in a stack of technologies that provide that application, provide data and access for that application. So, what's a tool or an approach that admins can use to cajole's not the right word, but maybe encourage adjacent team and team members to get on board and actually begin sharing information a little bit better so that you all succeed as a team with DevOps as opposed to just kind of having to wing it? Well,
that reminds me of something that my esteemed former industry analyst friend here was referencing, which is that I won't attempt to say a last name with a bunch of G's in it, but the sort of blog post that the Visual Studio Service guy had, right? And that really represents the in case of what you're getting to is you should relish sharing and documenting your failure and experiences. And that, if you go look at that blog post, it's this, like all great Microsoft blog posts, it's really long. But it really goes over in detail, like here's how we screwed up and here's what we learned. And we obviously didn't know a bunch of stuff and now we know it. And I mean, realistically, you have to figure out the reward structure that you do to people if they're not naturally motivated to share things. And so part of what you want to reward, somehow you need to work into the way probably you pay people, bonuses and comp, or give them like fancy bobbleheads or whatever. There's usually like a dearth of rewards that you can give people that are non-monetary oriented. But you can figure out some. And you need to figure out a way of rewarding and calling out those people, of saying like, these people prevented something bad from happening or made us better. They didn't just grow stuff, right?
Right.
And that's, again, a lot of DevOps, you'll hear people talking about culture, and that's a large part of it, is how do we set up that system of rewarding so that people will share things.
Yeah. I mean, sharing is really important to the point where in the DevOps echo chamber, whatever, when something goes down, when a particular service is unavailable that lots of people depend on, like Amazon or what have you, people get angry when there's not a postmortem. They're like, we want to know what happened, and Amazon will say like status update, EC2 down. And people just get furious, and then the luminaries are folks like Mark Imbriaco when he was working at GitHub. He would have these extensive things about like, well, this is what happened, this is how we remedied it, and this is how we're making sure it won't happen again. And people, when they look at that, they're like, wow, that I feel a lot more confident in that openness, that sharing. They're making sure that other people don't make the same mistakes they did.
Right.
And it's not just because it makes GitHub better. It makes you as a customer of GitHub more comfortable.
I think everybody forgets that when virtualization started, it was people that had to get their heads around. Oh gosh, I have to deal with this thing. And what do you mean by it's not per server? What? There's 15 servers in that box now, and so DevOps is still a lot to do with people, like what you're saying, and everybody wants to feel like they have a response when they're complaining that something's down and their query just doesn't go into a black hole, and
Right.
so I think that's why it's the sharing aspect. I think social media has helped even get engineers into sharing more, because I remember we would talk about anything in IRC because we were hidden behind a black and screen, right? We can say whatever we want, but now everybody is doing it too. So for us to actually learn from like open source as an example, everybody is quite happy to whinge and complain openly, but then get very defensive when it's their code that actually screwed something up.
Well, and I mean, there's a lot of complaining, but you kind of build up that thick skin where you're like, well, I can be open about our problems, and here's how we do things. Here's our code. You think you can do better? Like,
Please
let's do it
show
out
us,
in the open.
Well, but I think everyone's touched on a couple of things. One is transparency, which is really what we're talking about, is being transparent either within the team, so whoever's working on it, or transparency with the community. And I think that's important, and I think the more tools you have to do that, the better. And so we've seen a lot of different like new chat tools, if you think about the HipChat, Slacks, and all the other things that go along with that. I think that's helping. I think that helps for both engineering and for the DevOps side of the house and operations. There's a dearth of knowledge that's out there that you can leverage by being able to search through all of the things that were said in the channels and being able to get at that information that previously, if it was an email or something like that, trying to go through, if you've ever seen one of those emails where ultimately there's this super thin line of words because it's been embedded, that was horrible.
Yeah.
So just seeing that we're past that and we have tools that help us, I think that's big, and that helps the transparency. It helps us learn, and it helps us keep that knowledge. When that knowledge is lost, then we repeat the mistake or the error that we made before.
Exactly. I mean, nobody wants to make the same mistake twice.
I remember those long RCA emails when the data center would go down and everybody is on a bridge for 8 hours while we figure out what broke.
And you just hope it's not core email so that the email system doesn't go down.
That's right.
or telephony, or So here's the question then. A lot of people who sort of are coming to cloud fresh, DevOps is just a part of the way that they work. A lot of it too, maybe there's some reluctance to your point earlier that giving up control of being able to figure out why something broke when all of a sudden a whole lot of services and resources that you had direct control down to the metal over are now completely abstracted. But for when you move to the cloud, you just have to adopt DevOps practices because that's a part of the way that works. And for enterprises that are adopting hybrid, they're sort of being dragged to it and discovering that, oh, this is actually good for me, I'll find other ways to apply it. For some of our customers who are really smaller, where one or two admins wear a lot of hats, they sort of begin to use those practices on their own. Like QA, they'll actually get a license for a dev server that they can actually test even for network monitoring, for example, and then actually test it before they deploy because they don't want to work on the weekends. But for organizations that haven't begun to adopt it, where if they have a more than casual interest, they're beginning to get it. They're seeing people, a lot of blog posts, they're seeing a lot of people chat about it. Their friends who are maybe getting promoted in other organizations as they begin to adopt these practices, or maybe their weekends just get longer. What's a great way to start with DevOps? I mean, what's a great kind of hello world project for DevOps?
Well, I mean, generally I try to stick to consistent advice on this topic, and generally, like, the best thing you can do is find, it's kind of a paradoxical prioritization, but a low risk, high business value project, right? And that often involves, like, we need mobile, right? like we need a mobile app, and it's low risk because it doesn't exist yet, right? So you won't screw up something that exists by definition.
Right.
But it's also high visibility because everyone wants mobile.
Executives
right?
can at least understand what mobile is.
Exactly. And so basically what I'm saying is find a greenfield project, something that isn't encumbered by, you know, all your legacy stuff, because that's not going to work out well for you.
Don't pick email.
Exactly.
Or telephony.
And so find a project that, again, is relatively low risk, doesn't really take a lot of resources in all the meanings of that sense, but has potentially high customer value, and just experiment with that. And then after that, it depends on the capabilities you have and what you want to do. I mean, if you're not familiar with agile development, then it's probably good to read up on that, and then you just kind of want to, just like the virtual desktop example we were talking about, you want to start experimenting with it and learn it, and just kind of perfect the way you do that. I mean, unfortunately, there's not like anything that's even really as definitive as Scrum is in agile software development, or by any means as prescriptive as extreme programming. But there's more of just principles and guidelines.
But do you feel that that's actually something that makes it more attractive to admins because they come from that operational side? It forces it to be less theoretical than Agile would be, for example. It's not, they don't look at it as ISO 9000 or PCI compliance or something else like that.
Drink.
Well, so I think that's good guidance from a when you're ready to start making an impact on the business. But if you're just looking to like go home and do some things to where you start to learn some of the tools and other things, you could start off with, you know, there's looking at really simple projects that you spin up with something like Vagrant, which is something where you can start learning about automating. There's using scripting languages, and it doesn't matter. I'm not gonna like say, oh, this is the end all be all. There are dozens of them that you could use, but learning more about scripting and automating, and then learning about really building or picking out some example application. That's even from like a vendor website. If you're using something just to get things set up, you don't need to be a programmer to be able to pull that off. You need to be a programmer if you're going to try and write an enterprise application, but if you're trying to just take a sample app, you could do that, and then you could learn about how some of the other things like continuous integration work. You could take that sample app, but you could learn how to wire it up to a Jenkins or a Travis CI, or Travis CI is a great one to just start to understand some of these things in a very low risk way, very easy to get started, and start feeling your way around, and then going on to something like a Twitter, something like that, and seeing what people are saying about some of these things. You can pick up a lot just by doing that, and you can do all of that from, you know, your home machine.
Yeah. And chances are really good that there's something in your area that you can get involved in. I mean, there's meetups, there's DevOps days, there's, you know, depending on where you live, there are probably, you know, if you're somewhere nice like Austin, we have like dozens of meetups.
So many.
And for every little thing, and maybe the specific technology isn't what's important, but the people there are probably going to be wanting to talk about what they're up to, and finding, you know, your tribe or exposure to other folks doing the same sorts of things. There's a lot of great resources out there.
And most admins, when DevOps first started, they would freak out. They go, I'm not a programmer. I don't want to be a programmer. But they've been maintaining scripts for such a long time. I go, you're already doing it.
Yeah.
But it was just the cognitive bias, No, I write scripts. I'm not a programmer. It's the same thing.
Right. Well, I give the example of someone the other day that he does a lot of QoS policy map creation for networking. And he's got NetFlow. He's using CPQoS to measure the effectiveness of his maps. And he made the point, he's like, I draw it all out on the whiteboard, and then I start messing with it, and then I evolve it over time, and the map that I come out with is actually useful, where the one that I started with, to your point earlier about A/B testing, versus my grand idea, and I'm like, that's DevOps. You're doing
You
right
take
there.
that, just check it into source control.
Check in source control.
Well, and if
Which
you
is
think
scary.
about it, programming is figuring out how you're going to apply some logic and making the computer perform that logic, whatever it is. So if you understand macros or Excel, if you've ever done some complex things between multiple sheets in Excel, it's actually programming.
Yeah.
Right.
You might not think it is, but it is. It may not be the most sophisticated programming in the world, but you're still dealing with concepts that come from programming.
Yeah. I mean, your sudoers conf has inputs and it gives you outputs. You just can't log in.
All right, so not to be a buzzkill, I'm going to ask a terrible question because I've had a lot of people ask me, and every time I answer it, I tend to be a little bit of a downer, and I just want to make sure that I'm somewhat accurate about this. Yeah, brace yourself. So the future of IT is going to be driven by software. Whether we talk about now software-defined networking and now software-defined storage, and pretty soon it kind of turns into software-defined apps. So programming is the key to making that happen. And so in the future, those who are certainly promoted with accelerated careers, but maybe even those who are just even retained, are going to be thinking about programming first and configuring in the traditional sense second. What does that horizon look like, do you think? And what percentage of IT is going to need to know at least a basic understanding of how to programmatically manage their environments versus being able to just get in with the green screen and fix things?
I think most operations guys need to start thinking about that. If a lot of them already are, but you need to start thinking, like, if you think your job is to keep Exchange running, that is not your job, because Exchange can be outsourced, it can be SaaS'd, and then what is your job? Like, you need to think about, how do I best align what I do with the company? Right. And the company probably sells a product, provides a service, and you need to make sure that whatever you're doing aligns with making the company money. Running Exchange does not make any company money, except for people who host Exchange.
So I remember at Cisco Live /Networkers around about 2010-ish, the vBlock had just come out. So that was when converged infrastructure was starting to be more of a thing. And there was at Live, there was all these vBlocks that were in there, massive, very sexy gear, which I really liked because I was on that team. I had these big groups of guys that would walk by, point at the whole rack, and go, that's going to make me lose my job. And they were saying this, and so I stopped him and I said, why? What makes you say that? He goes, well, I'm a storage admin. That's going to make me lose my job. I said, no, because you're going to get to learn virtualization. You're going to get to learn networking. Now you get to do 3 times what you're able to do. Don't you think that means you're going to get a bonus? Don't you think
or you're going to get your Cisco UCS certification and take a 40% increase in what you're
Well, but I mean, at the time it was hard for them to see because they were so used to their siloed way of doing things. And for them, it's like, well, I'm going to lose my control of my LUNs and my this and my that. And I said that, I was like, no, you're going to get to learn virtualization. You're going to get to increase productivity for the systems that you actually manage and everything else. Don't you see that you can now get training? You can now get this, and you can do 3 times more work than you already do, and get your weekends to yourself and get better bonuses. He stopped and he went, I never thought about it that way. And now fast forward, it's been 5 years, and conversion, everybody, the virtualization guy knows networking, knows storage, is looking at SDN, they're starting to think about the whole DevOps thing. So I really like that DevOps is forcing people into that new mindset, the way virtualization forced a lot of admins into the new mindset.
And so much of the of that is backed up with the culture of sharing. It's like, I know that technology is moving really fast. I know that, back in the day, I was an admin for a box, maybe 10 boxes, and now it's like, Facebook, it's 25,000 per engineer. And, you need to keep training and sharing that information, or you're going to be the guy like, where do I hook up these horses to the cart, right?
Yeah, and to seemingly join your buzzkill party. I think I think there's a rule. I think maybe it was like Luke Knies of his his buddies at Puppet who kind of started talking about this. Is like there will always be more servers, right? Like if you look at the trajectory of IT, there's always going to be more gear, and this is where you can get into the plumb the depths of biz lore and everything and DevOps and go read up on Jevons paradox and things like that. But like essentially, like if you make something cheaper to use as the sort of average weight of Americans show, you'll grow, right? Like we have really cheap food, so we're big. And like so if infrastructure is cheap to consume, you'll consume a lot of it. Yeah. And we used to have a phrase called VM sprawl, right? Which sort of was like, if I was a physical admin, virtualization probably freaked me out, as we were talking about. And it's like, oh, actually, it just multiplies my value, right? Because now instead of 10 servers, I have 100 servers, and it's a nightmare to manage or whatever. And in the area that I work in during my day job, a lot of what we talk with people about is how do you write the new applications, your own custom software that's going to help you run your business. And it is a different skill set for some people who are admins. But there is a real dearth of talent in that area of people to manage. And so sure, you're going to need to read a book or go to a week-long class or get your chef certificate of awesomeness or whatever. but like probably if you entered into the IT world, you were always learning. And if you've just gotten tired of it, then maybe you should not get tired of it, right? Like you need to learn new things, but it's really not that big of a deal.
Well, and there's no one who's a vCenter manager who used to stack and rack, and their back would hurt moving servers in and out of racks.
Right.
Is now not much happier to just click and set and move systems with the GUI, or if they're using some of the more sophisticated tools, they're actually writing policies to allow things like autonomous vMotion based on resource availability, and that's programming.
Yeah, and I mean to use the classic metaphor of this conversation, right? Like, I mean, if you were a Teamster driving a Stagecoach, then hey, you need to learn how to drive a truck.
Right.
Sorry, right? Like that's just the way it is. But like, it doesn't mean that you can no longer find any employment at all, right? Like, it just means you need to learn a somewhat different skill for one of the tools that you use.
Well, I see it as there are quite a few things that you can do, but people are afraid of change. And the reality is, I think I've at least come across quite a few admins that are afraid to automate everything because they think they're going to automate themselves out of a job. And when you point out that what happens when the automation breaks, because it will, who's going to fix the automation? Yeah. Who's there to fix the machines? Because they won't fix themselves.
Exactly. I mean, you generate that much more value for yourself by automating things because you're the guy who now, instead of managing 100 boxes, knows how 10,000 of them are wired together. And that means you also don't have to go back and hand install the 100 boxes and rack and stack. You can move on to more interesting problems that is why the business has you there
with higher visibility that can actually get you promoted.
But there's still going to be a class of people out there that, the small office that has 10 machines and has 3 machines over here. Yeah. And it's just not worth them doing, and the guy wants to be there. He's the same guy that wants to change the tapes, and that guy keeps the lights on.
The problem for him is when somebody is like, wait, why aren't we just using like hosted Exchange, or how come we're not using Office 365?
Because I take the stuff from the customer and I walk it over to like the engineer
or their fax.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. Yes, there is still fax.
Well, I hate to actually shut this down, but we are about out of time. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thanks again, everyone, for coming. Just one last question. Certainly, give everyone your Twitter information so that they can follow you. And if you want to list some sort of getting sources started resources that they might want to check out, that'd be great too. Who wants to go first?
I'm at McCrory on Twitter. That's MCCRORY, and I would say, and I mentioned it earlier, Vagrant, VAGAR. I think. Yeah, there you go. That's what I knew my wife for spelling. Along with quite a few other things, there are the chefs and puppets of the world where you can learn about automation with recipes and such, which make automating things great. There are all sorts of other scripting things like Ruby, which is a fairly approachable language. Python is another very approachable language if you're looking to get started. It's not as hard to learn as something like a .NET or Java, in my opinion. Those are great places to get started.
And I am at Cloud of Caroline, as in the Cloud of Caroline, with INE. And I think a really good resource would actually be devops.com. There's a lot of really good, useful information there for people to actually start to learn about and things like that. It's not just all about Scrum. There's other ways that you can do things, so do not be afraid.
And I'm just Cote, C-O-T-E, in Twitter. You can put an @ in front of it if you want. It's always a bum deal when you're the last person to ask a question like this, so I feel sorry for Matt. But I'll try to make an obscure reference so we can get the easy one. So I think chapter 8 of this book called the Practice of Cloud System Administration is excellent. It's the chapter entitled DevOps. And it's actually really good. And I think I read that chapter maybe like 4 or 5 times, because whenever I get confused about what DevOps is, I go back and read that, and it's a nice summary from last year. And it'll draw up and encapsulate a lot of what we're talking about, and you can click on links to read your primary sources if you like that kind of thing.
So I'm Matt Ray, at Matt Ray on Twitter, kind of easy. If we're recommending books, there's O'Reilly had a book about 4 or 5 years ago called Web Operations. It is kind of, DevOps wasn't totally a thing yet, but I think there might have been a DevOps chapter. But each chapter kind of tackles a different silo of what it means to run, web operations. But really, they're the sorts of things as an operator you think about, like, well, how do I do monitoring? How do I do provisioning? How do I think about security? How do I think about infrastructure as code? And each chapter is written by someone different. So I think there's a Agile infrastructure one written by Andrew Clay Schaefer. That kind of turned into DevOps. There's an infrastructure as code. It's not tool specific, which is really nice. It's just the high level things. Great book, still really relevant. And then if you're thinking about like the allegory of the DevOps transformation. The Phoenix Project is it's kind of the go-to book. It's a good book. It's worth reading, and hopefully you will see yourself on the transformation side and not the pre-transformation side.
Awesome. Well, thanks all of you for being here. We'll add the reading list information links to the video below, so you can check those all out. Thanks again for coming, and thanks all of you for being here.
You so blessed.